Hi everyone, welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith. In this video, we're going to learn how to play the 2 to 4 player game Theseus, The Dark Orbit by Portal Games. Theseus floats like a dead, long-abandoned space station, but within its dark and dangerous corridor, several factions are still fighting for control, whether they be aliens, marines, scientists, or the mysterious Greys. You will control one of these factions in an attempt to defeat your opponents or collect the valuable data needed to win. So join me at the table and let's learn how to play. To start, each player picks one of the 4 factions from the game. They each have a unique color that helps you identify their sector board, 3 units, 25 faction cards, and either 1 or 2 life and data point markers. Each faction also has a unique set of tokens. We'll set up a 2-player game, choosing the scientists and the aliens, returning the other faction components to the box. Now we place the life and data points board in the middle of the table, with the end token nearby along with the upgrade tokens. Each player puts a marker on the 20 space of the life tracker, and if you have a second token, put it on the 0 space of the data tracker. Along with the faction-specific sector boards, there are also 3 general ones as well. This sector represents the corridors of Theseus, and you place it like so. Then you put down the control room, giving it the malfunction token. In this position, you're going to place the first player's sector board. In Theseus, the owner of the game decides who will go first. We'll put the alien sector board here. Then you place the tech bay, and finally, the second player's sector board is added to the table. For advanced players, or in a 3 or 4 player game, you can instead shuffle up the sector boards and then place them randomly around the life and data points tracker. In that case, the first player will be the first faction sector board you come to after the corridors, traveling in clockwise direction. Then the second faction board you come to is the second player, and so on. These spaces on the sector boards are known as installed card slots. Some of them show this icon to remind you that at the start of the game, they will begin with one of these bonus cards already installed in their position. So then you take these yellow bonus cards, shuffle them up, and starting with the corridor, moving in clockwise direction, you put one in each space showing that symbol. Any remaining bonus cards that are not used are then returned to the box. Now each player takes their own faction cards, shuffles them up, and draws 15 to form a deck. The remaining cards are also returned to the box. When playing your first game of Theseus, you're advised to create your 15-card deck a little differently. You'll notice here I've laid out all 25 cards of the alien faction showing their backside. And on the edge, you'll either find 0, 1, 2, or 3 dots. This represents the relative complexity that these cards will add to the gameplay. So for your first game, you may just want to choose the 15 cards that show no dots. And then in future games, start shuffling in some of these more complex cards to then randomly create your 15-card deck. However you form your faction deck, be sure to shuffle it, but place it face up on the table. You'll always be able to see the top card of your deck, which will show an image on the bottom half. The tokens that come with your faction are brought into play based on the cards in your deck. Now, I've formed these decks using those basic 15 cards, so I know which tokens are not going to be used, and I've removed them from the table just to keep my teaching space a little cleaner. Now, once the players have formed their decks, they'll each draw the top 3 cards, and then in turn order, pick one of their cards to place in any empty installed card space in any sector. It's important to note, you can never have more than 1 card in a single slot. And on the front of the card, you will find the information to tell you how the card works. But if during gameplay you're unsure, you can always look at the back where you will find additional information. If a card's instructions on the back begins with the word instant, then you cannot install it onto a sector. Most cards are activated by being on a sector board, But instants are played directly from your hand. So if during the setup you have an instant as one of your 3 cards, instead of installing a card to the boards, you can instead keep that card in your hand to be used later. I don't actually have an instant, so in this case I'm going to place this small laboratory for the scientists onto the scientist's sector board. Now all of the players will take the remaining 2 cards and place them in the pending card slot of their faction's sector board, which are located here just below the zeroed out timers found on most sector boards. So these 2 remaining scientist cards would be placed like this. And unlike installed card slots, instant cards can be placed in pending card slots. Now it's time to place your units. Each player has 3, and there are 2 sides, base and advanced. They always start on their base side. Every sector has a circular area divided into 4 rooms which can each hold a single unit. In turn order, each player puts 2 of their units in any of the 4 rooms on their sector. And then, once again, in turn order, each player will place the remaining unit in any available room of any sector. So I'm placing the aliens in the corridor and the scientists in the tech bay. That seems thematically accurate. Well, you'll also want to, of course, keep your own cards and tokens near you, but because I'm controlling both factions, I just have them both here together. You may also want to keep out this special card. It breaks down what happens during a player's turn, and this can be useful when you're first learning the game. And that's how you set up the game. In Theseus, you'll be moving your units and taking actions, and one of the actions you'll want to take is to attack your opponent's units. But you don't do damage to the units specifically. Instead, you remove that damage from that faction's life total. Some factions can also collect data points, so you'll win by either collecting 20 data points first or reducing your opponent's life total to 0. If neither of those things happen before the game ends, then the player with the highest combined data and life points is the winner. Theseus is played over a series of turns, and on your turn you will complete 4 phases. So let's take a look at how you do the first phase, movement. Here, you'll pick any one of your units to move by first counting all of the units from all factions in that chosen unit sector. This becomes that unit's movement points. So for example, this alien has 1 movement point, whereas this alien has 2 movement points. And if the scientist had been in the sector, it would have 3 movement points total. You must move 1 sector in a clockwise direction for every movement point you have. You can't leave any of them unspent. So this alien would have to move to this sector. When you arrive at your destination, you place your unit in any empty available room space. In future turns, it will be possible to end your movement in a room where all of the spaces are already filled by other units. This causes an ejection. The player bringing the unit into the sector chooses a unit already there and then places it on one of the outer space spots found on the data and life points tracker. The unit moving in is then placed in the now vacated room. You may even choose to eject one of your own units into outer space, which will probably cause your opponent great delight. Now after moving, you now resolve any of your opponent's trap cards in the sector that you move to. Now I don't have any trap cards out right now, so let me add a couple and we'll show you how that would work. Trap cards carry this symbol as a visual reminder that there are traps in this sector. So if a scientist had moved into this space, it would trigger the alien's trap, which says 1 wound to the enemy. So the scientist faction would immediately lose 1 life point. Some traps, like the tentacles, remind you on the back that they use the crescent-shaped token of their faction. Most of your opponent's traps will only trigger and affect you if you end your movement in a sector with that opponent's trap. However, these tokens are placed on the crescent symbol here when their trap cards are first installed, and they act as a visual reminder that this trap will trigger just simply by passing through the sector, even if you don't stop there. If more than 1 trap triggers in a room that you move into, then as the active player, you get to decide the order in which they're resolved. After ending movement and resolving any traps, if all rooms of the sector you moved into are full, as they are here, a lesser onslaught occurs. This will also happen when you move into an already full sector and boot a unit into space. We'll talk about onslaughts and lesser onslaughts, which are forms of attacks, a little bit later. But next, let's move on to the action cards phase. Here, you'll be able to resolve all of your installed action cards from your faction in the sector that you move to. Now, if resolving these in a certain order is important, then you as the active player get to decide which order those cards are resolved in. Action cards are helpfully marked with this symbol for easy identification. So during the action card phase, the scientist who moved here would get to resolve this effect that says gain 1 data point, or DP, for each enemy unit stationed in this sector. So the scientist faction would get 2 data points for moving here, which would be collected right away. Now it's time for the third phase, sector action. Each board has icons here representing that sector's specific action. You always resolve this action unless you're in your opponent's sector. The corridors show the symbol for an onslaught. If you end your movement in this sector, then during the sector action phase, all of your units in all sectors automatically attack enemy units. But they don't get to attack back. This is you using the advantage of the corridors to unleash your attacks upon them. Now, there are some restrictions. Your units may only attack enemy units that are in rooms connected by passages. For example, this scientist's room is connected by a passage to this alien's room, but not to this alien, which is behind a wall. Of the enemies that you can see, you will be able to wound a number of them based on the attack symbols showing on your unit. This scientist doesn't actually have any attack symbols, so even though it can see this alien, during an onslaught it would not be able to cause any wounds. We'll learn later how you can upgrade your units, but when this scientist is upgraded, it gains a lightning bolt symbol. A single lightning bolt means this scientist will be able to wound up to 1 enemy that it can see during an onslaught. This upgraded alien has 3 lightning bolts, which means it can wound up to 3 eligible targets. So if there was a scientist in this room during an onslaught triggered by the alien faction, this alien would be able to cause a wound to both this scientist and this scientist because there's a passage connecting to both of them. That would count as 2 wounds, which you would remove from the scientist's life point tracker. A single blue lightning bolt allows you to collect 1 data point from an opponent instead of causing a wound during an onslaught. Keep in mind, the amount of damage you cause during an onslaught is based on the number of your eligible attackers. So in this sector, although there's only 1 alien, each scientist can cause 1 wound and has a line of passage to the target. So this would be a total of 2 wounds, which you would remove from the alien's faction. I mentioned that if you end your movement in a sector that now has a unit in every room, a lesser onslaught occurs. This is resolved in the same way as a regular onslaught, except instead of all of your units throughout Theseus attacking, only those in the sector that you move to will resolve attacks. So those are the rules related to the onslaught sector action of the corridors. But now let's take a look at what happens when you move a unit into the tech bay and get to the sector action phase. These 2 arrows means you must choose another of your units and take an extra turn with it. Sector actions are mandatory, so you will have to move another of your units, even if this won't be helpful to you. But you cannot move the same unit twice during your turn, so now that I've placed a second unit into the tech bay during the sector action phase, I'm going to have to move this unit as well, which also puts it into the tech bay. In this case, once you get to the sector action phase, you won't be able to move any units because you have none left to move. To help you keep track of which units you've already moved during your turn, the tech bay has double circles in each of the rooms. So you would place your units in the outer circle when they first move into the room, and then at the end of your turn, you would move them back into their regular position. Some card effects will allow you to move an enemy unit, but you still can't move this unit more than once during a single turn. So even if the sector you've moved it to doesn't have those double circles, feel free to slide it to the edge of the sector as a reminder. Next is the control room. The sector action here causes you to place the malfunction token on any pending or installed card of your opponent in any sector. If the malfunction token had already been on a card, you can choose to place it on the same card again. You may not, however, place it on one of the bonus cards that we put out during the setup. We haven't discussed pending cards in detail yet, but it's enough to know that if a malfunction token is on one, then that card cannot be discarded or installed. It's as if the pending slot itself doesn't even exist. It works in the same way when placed on an installed card. Just treat that card and slot as if it doesn't exist either. Some card effects will cause tokens to be brought into play that have their own independent functions. For example, the Parasite card will cause a parasite to be attached to an enemy unit that will then travel with that unit when it moves around the board. When you place a malfunction token on the Parasite card, it doesn't cause those tokens to be removed. They stay in effect, but now new parasites will not be brought into play until the malfunction token is removed. Some tokens just act as helpful reminders. So in the case of the tentacles, if the malfunction token is placed there, this trap really doesn't exist anymore, so the tentacles can be removed and just placed on the card. As soon as the malfunction token is relocated, then the trap goes back into effect and the token can be placed again. Faction boards have the same two sector action choices, but these can only be triggered by the owner of the faction when they land there. So this alien moving onto the Scientist faction board would skip the sector action phase. But if a scientist had moved onto its own board, then you would get to choose which of the two actions you'd like to take. But a scientist moving onto its own faction board gets to choose one of these two actions to take. This first one allows you to remove an opponent's installed card on your sector board. Now, discarded cards are always removed from play. They aren't put into a discard pile to be used later. Alternatively, the player could choose to collect an upgrade token. These can be used right away or saved for use during the player's future turns. One use for an upgrade token is to return it to the supply in order to upgrade any one of your units in any sector. You do this by simply flipping it over to the advanced side. Or you may add an upgrade token to any of your installed cards that show a number within the upgraded gear symbol. Each token you add to that card boosts its effect by 1. For example, these archives give the Scientist player 1 upgrade token when they land in its sector, but now that it's upgraded, they will receive 2 upgrade tokens for landing here. The first upgrade to any card is free, but to add additional upgrades to that same card, you must also be able to discard as many tokens as the number of upgrades already there. So to upgrade the archives again, I would need to have 2 tokens at least, 1 to discard and then 1 to place on the card. Your upgrade should always be clearly visible, and at most you can have 6 on a single card. You can use as many of your upgrade tokens as you want at any time during your turn. But now we know all of the sector board actions, so let's take a look at the final phase, the pending card phase. Remember, pending cards are those found outside of the sector boards beneath these zeroed out timers. And the cards here do not have direct impact on gameplay. Their card effects can't be activated. So let's pretend it's the scientist's turn and they've landed on this sector and it's now the pending card phase. There are 3 possible situations and the player must pick one of them to resolve. If there is an empty slot like we see here, you can choose to take the top card off of your faction deck and place it there. Or if there's an enemy faction card, you can choose to discard it instead, removing it from play and then replace it with the top card from your faction deck. And finally, if you have one of your cards in a pending slot in that sector, you may choose to install it, but it can go into any empty installed card slot of any sector. You then take the top card from your deck and place it in the vacated pending slot. You can install your cards onto a space with a bonus card, but you then claim the bonus card to use right away or to save for use in one of your future turns. Bonus cards should always be visible to other players. Likewise, when installing a card to the board, you may replace one of your own already installed cards, discarding it from the game. The pending card phase is optional. You can skip it if you want. It's also the last phase, so once it's complete, the next player starts their turn. We should also talk about how this game ends. If at any time you're required to place a card into a pending slot, for example, after you've removed an enemy's pending card, and you have no cards left in your faction deck, well then you're going to need to move the end token on the life and data points tracker. So the first time this happens, you place the token on the 3 position. The next time you move it to the 2 position, and so on. Once it reaches the final spot, the game ends immediately. Now players add up the sum of their life and data points, with the highest total being the winner. So in this case, the alien faction has 12 points and the scientists have 5 plus 9 for 14, so the scientists would win. In the case of a tie, the tied players each take one additional turn, starting with the player after the one who ended the game. If there's still a tie at that point, the game ends and the players share the victory. Now remember, the pending card phase is optional, so if you're in a losing position and your faction deck is empty, you may want to skip that phase to prevent the end token from advancing to the final spot. But remember, this also means your opponent is winning and they want the game to end, so you probably don't have a lot of time left. The other way you can win and end the game immediately is by reducing your opponent's life points to 0. Or if you're one of the factions that can collect data points, collecting 20 will win you the game. Now we just have a few things left to cover, so join me back at the table and we'll go over them. Remember how I said that units can be ejected into space and placed on the life and data points board? Well, in the move phase, instead of moving a unit in a sector, you may instead take one of your units from space and then place it in any empty room of any sector. You then resolve any traps in the sector, but otherwise nothing else happens. Even lesser onslaughts are ignored. Your turn just ends. And although they only show 6 spaces here, any number of units can be placed in outer space. Also, if you're resolving the tech-based sector action, you may choose to bring one of your units in space back to the board. But this will still end your turn after resolving any traps, even if you place that unit into the tech bay. Tokens are a limited supply, so if you're trying to take an action to place a token, but all of them are already in use, then you have to skip that action. But unlike cards, discarded tokens go back into your supply to be used later. Now I mentioned that instant cards are not installed, instead you play them from your hand. But they still first get placed in pending card slots. This means that when you go to install a card, you may choose a pending instant card and take it into your hand. Once an instant is in your hand, it can be used right away or saved for use at any point during one of your future turns. You can even play several at once. But remember, these are single-use cards, so once they're resolved, just return them to the box. Now there are a few changes for a 3 or 4 player game. First of all, during the setup, you'll randomly place all of the sector boards. Or you can have the players one at a time place a randomly chosen sector board. Also, during setup only, if a sector is filled by placed units, it will not trigger a lesser onslaught. Players also set their life points to 0 at the start of a game, and now if you wound an enemy, you gain life points rather than subtract from theirs. This new way of tracking life does change some card effects. For example, the Medbay card, rather than restoring life points to the scientist, now subtracts life points from any enemy. If the Medbay had been upgraded, then the scientist player divides the total number of life points lost amongst any number of opponents as they see fit. I mentioned there are card effects that allow you to move another player's units, and if you move a unit onto a space that triggers a trap, it's the owner of that trap that receives the life points from the wounds caused. Now, if a player gains 20 life points, they immediately win the game, or if a player gains 20 data points. As before, if the end token reaches the final space, the player with the highest combined life and data points wins. If that causes a tie, then the tied players each take an extra turn, and if that doesn't break the tie, they share the victory. And that's how you play Theseus, the Dark Orbit. There is additional information in the rulebook for playing team matches, as well as for a 5th faction known as the Pandoras. They suggest you try this faction once you've mastered the game and you're looking for an additional challenge. But I'll leave you to uncover the mysteries of that faction on your own. There has been a frequently asked questions document released for Theseus. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video, but where applicable, I've included those updates in this episode. If you have any questions, though, please don't hesitate to ask them in the comments below. I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. If I find there's certain questions being asked over and over again, I'll include those answers in the description of this video, so you may want to check there first. And I do hope you'll subscribe to our channel and join us later, because we're going to be doing a full playthrough of Theseus. I'm going to have a friend of mine join me remotely, and we're going to play the game so you can really see how it all comes together. But until the next episode, thanks for watching.